Hi guys, I'm Talia's Threads and today I am showing you how to make the Wavelength Pouch. It comes in three shapes, so this is the circle and then the square, which is what we're going to make today, and then the rectangle. And if you need any inspiration, I'm going to put some testers makes up on the screen. As always, the pattern is linked below with any other resources I think you may need. So let's get into it. So I have my pattern here and each one has a top, a bottom and a back. I will be making the square pouch today, so I'm going to put these away, but the principles are the same for all three. So each piece needs one cut of the outer fabric and one cut of the lining fabric. So I'm going to cut out my front, the bottom and the top first, and I'm going to decide, because I'm using something with a print, so I'm going to decide how I want the print centered, and I'm going to center over the lighter line in the gingham and then make sure that this one is centered over the lighter line in the gingham as well, so that the lines will match up once the pouch is finished. And I have centered the back panel over the light gingham check as well. You don't have to do that, but it just means that the pouch will match from front to back. So the first step is to add the top panel to the zipper, and the right side of the main fabric needs to be facing the right side of the zipper, and the right side of the lining fabric needs to be facing the wrong side of the zipper, so that when you fold them back after sewing, the right side is going to be facing outwards on both sides. And you'll notice I'm just starting at a random place on my zipper, and that's because this is a nylon coil zipper, so we'll just be sewing over it. And on the ends there's little metal stops and the pull, so I'm going to sew it all with those out of the way. So adding both layers at once. However, if you are a beginner, you may find it easier to add one layer at a time so that they're not all moving around. That can help to control the fabric. And the seam allowance on the zipper is 3/8 of an inch. Now press your fabric out of the way of the zipper, and then we're going to top stitch it 1/8 of an inch away from the edge. The next step is to add the bottom panel, and I am going to take a moment to match up the lines from the checks. So I'm going to pin it in place, and then, or just hold it in place and then just check that it will be lined up. Perfect. And then you can just take it back to the machine and top stitch at 1/8 inch. So now we're ready to connect all the layers together, and you want to have your back piece outer fabric facing right sides down, and then you're going to place the back piece lining fabric right sides facing up, so the right side is facing out on both sides, and then place the lining layer of the front panel you just made onto the back panel. And then we're going to pin or clip around the edges and then sew the edges together at 1/8 inch seam allowance so that they can be stable and not shift around when we're trying to add the bias binding, but because we're going to use a smaller seam allowance, it won't be seen on the finished pouch. So now I have everything in place. Before I go and sew, I'm going to move the zipper into the middle. Obviously, if you leave the zipper out here and then you sew this stitch, then you're not going to be able to get the pouch open. I like to set the needle orientation over to the right, and then I can line up the side of my presser foot with the edge of the fabric and get a really nice small seam allowance. Just take it slow and drop the needle and lift the presser foot around the tight curves. Now we're ready to trim the edges, ready for the bias binding. My fabric has shifted around a little bit. This linen is very shifty and then the lining is very stable. So I'm just going to trim off, but try to preserve the curves. Like if you trim too much, then it could just become straight and it's not going to look all cute and wavy. And these are my special zipper scissors. I always use them to cut zippers because if you use your fabric shears to cut the zippers, then they will get blunt really quickly. So to make your own bias tape, you need to take your fabric and cut it at a 45-degree angle. Now, if you have a quilting ruler, there should be lines on your ruler. I'm not sure if you can see that, but this is the 45-degree angle line on my ruler, and I'm going to line that up with the selvage edge of the fabric and just cut straight along with my rotary cutter. Now you have your 45-degree angle line, and if you line up the ruler with the edge, you will get perfect bias strips every time. However, if you don't have one of these rulers and you don't know how to get a 45-degree angle, what you can do, and this only works if the fabric was cut straight, so if your fabric was cut wonky, then you'll have to try another option, but fold the selvage edge along so it's in half, matching the cut edge. So if you still had the whole piece of fabric, it would look like this. And as you can see, you can cut along. So I take my fabric and I line it up the folded edge straight with my cutting mat, and then I can cut at a 90-degree angle from that and get perfect bias strips. So for 1/4 inch bias binding, you may think that you'd cut 1 inch wide. However, you need to consider the fact that the bias tape is going to be folded and you're going to lose a tiny bit of width each time, and then to accommodate going around the seams and things. So actually you cut it at 1.25 inches wide. Now you have your bias strips. You can attach these right sides facing. This fabric doesn't really have a right and a wrong side. However, if yours does, try and pay attention to that. And you're going to place them at a 90-degree angle to each other, and you're going to stitch diagonally across. And you want the stitching line to meet where the fabric joins on each one. Otherwise, once you fold this back open, they won't match up properly. If you have a long seam allowance, then you can trim some off, and I'm just trimming the fluffy edges from the selvage of mine. And then press each seam allowance open. And then trim the little excess triangles off. Now, if you have a bias tape maker, then you can make this however you want. But the way that I like to do it is manually, and I do it in 2 passes. So on the first pass, I'm just going to press the bias tape in half all the way down. And then for the second pass, I start off by folding one edge into the middle. And then you can fold the other edge into the middle and match them up. And then you should be able to just tuck them into the middle where they meet and move the iron along. It's a little fiddly at first, but once you get down far enough, you can put a pin into your mat to hold the bias tape in place, and then the tension that this creates allows you to fold it much easier. So now you can just give a slight pull on it and fold the edges in, and it goes really quickly. And then you can just move the bias tape along and repin and keep going. We're going to join the bias binding when we get around to the end, so I'm leaving a tail that we can use to join it to itself once we get back around. And I'm just adding one pin, and I'm going to move the bias binding around as I go rather than pre-pinning it, because it will shift and you need to give a little stretch when you are in these valley portions to get the bias binding looking tight. So if you pin it around, it's probably going to shift anyway. It can be very helpful around the tight curves to drop the needle and lift the presser foot and sort of shimmy the project around and play with the bias tape, make sure it's laying flat. Any puckers in the bias tape that are right under the needle will show as like a pleat in the sewing, but if there are puckers sort of like further down under the presser foot and you're not quite sewing over that part yet, then you don't need to worry about those. But yeah, if you see any lumps in the bias tape coming up, you can just drop the presser foot then, and then lift up, drop the needle, sorry, and then lift the presser foot and just smooth out that bump before it gets under the needle. And then coming back around, I have left a little gap, and I may have not left enough gaps, so what I'm going to do is unpick this bit slightly here. I didn't want to stop sewing right on the corner just because I feel like this more straight bit, like just because the tighter corners are obviously harder to sew around than these more smoothed out curves. So I'm going to unpick this bit here where it's a little bit more, a little bit less curved, and it'll be easier to finish off the bias tape. So the next thing to do is to walk the bias tape around the edges, and I'm going to cut that one off here. And then walk this one so it overlaps, and then from the point of overlapping I'm going to measure down the same width as the bias tape unfolded. So this bias tape is 1.25 inches wide total, so I'm going to overlap them by 1.25 inches. And then trim this one off at that point. Now what we're going to do is place these right sides facing at a 90-degree angle. So I'll show you again. Completely unfolded, right sides facing. And then you can just use some pins to hold it in place while you match it all up. So diagonally from the corner of this one to the corner of this one, straight across like that. So now we're going to trim the seam allowance down and press it open. Now you can go back to your machine and sew this last little section. And I do usually pin this one in place just because I like to try and stretch the bias tape in a way where it evens it out. Now I'm just going to fold the bias tape around the seams and see if it's sitting nice and flat. You may need to go back to the machine and sew a little tighter in the valley portions. I have done one here to show you. I've just done this second stitching line further in, and that will help with if you're finding your bias tape is looking baggy around the valley portions of the waves. And then also if the corners are looking too tight and the fabric's really puckering up, what you can do is just trim a tiny bit off the curve and then try again. Sometimes there's just too much bulk there after you've sewn the seams, so you need to trim off some of the seam allowance to allow it to sit flat. And now I'm just going to top stitch the bias tape down as close as I can to the edge here, catching that underneath, and then we'll be finished. And there you have your beautiful finished wavelength pouch.